really appreciate this opportunity to work with your supporters and other interested folk. And I want to acknowledge the courage, really, of all of you who are here tonight at a time of a number of crises becoming evident to us, both not just the climate crisis, as we've lost that large ice sheet on Ellesmere Island this week, but also the crises in our own racial relations and the justice system, so-called, as we've seen over the last several months. And over top of all of this, the COVID crisis. And I think especially of parents and those facing decisions about the upcoming school year and those who have to make decisions about the school year. These are really tough times. But to try and look beyond these immediate crises to the crisis which is here but growing much more slowly and less visibly, namely the climate crisis. And so to spend some time tonight on thinking about that crisis and how can we facilitate conversations in our own circles, our families, our friends, our neighbors, our workplaces, and our own political leaders as to how to address this. And I'd like to share with you tonight a particular tool that's been developed to help us in those conversations. It's a means of engaging in conversation, looking at some possibilities, imagining other types of futures than the one that we're currently tracking on now. So I'd like to move into sharing some slides with you by way of introduction, and then we'll move into the simulation. So let me set up my share screen here. So the En-ROADS organization and the climate workshop that they have developed was developed by two groups in particular, Climate Interactive, which is a group of scientists and systems dynamicists in cooperation with MIT's Sloan School of Management, and in particular their sustainability initiative. And these groups have been working for several years to develop this tool and some companion tools with it. And they're using the best science that we have. So I'll share a bit of that with you and then look at some scenarios for climate success that we could develop together here tonight and then have some reflection time on that. So this particular tool has 15,000 equations in it, economic, physical, and other equations that help to model the climate and the economic interactions across the globe. So it's a global model that we're looking at tonight. And it's been tested against all of the big climate change models that physicists and climate scientists have developed. So it's been well calibrated against that. And the real, I guess, exciting part of this tool is that it solves all of these equations in 60 milliseconds. So you can propose a policy initiative and see immediately in real time what the implications of that could be, what kind of a scenario that would lead to. And they've also made the tool available for free. So after this session tonight, or even while we're here tonight, you can look at this tool yourself. And that makes it a really valuable way of engaging others in your circles in these conversations. So this is the main screen that we'll be working with for most of tonight. And it's this particular simulation model helps us to create some different scenarios as to what might happen. So you can see down below here, there are some little levers here that you can move, or sliders you can move from side to side to simulate what might happen with a particular policy initiative. So if you wanted to add renewables, or if you wanted to reduce renewables, if you wanted to put a tax on coal, then you can simulate what would happen to the global temperature and what would happen to primary sources of energy and other aspects. So we'll be coming back to that in more detail tonight. So let's look at some of the science of what's at stake. And I'm sure most of this is not news to you, that Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels are rising faster than they have in the last almost million years, and that's a primary source of global warming, both in the oceans, on the land, and in the air above it. And so what we're seeing as a result of that increasing uh, uh, emission of carbon dioxide and concentration in the atmosphere is global surface temperatures are rising rapidly, basically since the start of the Industrial Revolution and the burning of coal in larger quantities. And right now, the primary sources of carbon dioxide emissions, still a large amount coming from coal, probably up to 15 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year being put into the atmosphere from the burning of coal across the planet. Almost as much coming from the burning of oil, primarily in transportation, and an rapidly increasing amount coming from natural gas. And even some of that is substituting for coal. And there have been land use changes, deforestation, and changes in agriculture output and composition right since before the Industrial Revolution and continuing today. And so the consequence of that is that we're seeing the global temperature increasing. So if we're going back to see here at the year 2020, we're more than 1 degree Celsius above the temperatures of the pre-industrial era. And on the present business as usual case, that could hit 4.1 degrees by the end of this century. Now, in the Paris Climate Agreement, the 197 nations of the world agreed to try and contain global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius, and ideally to 1.5 degrees. And so that's what we'll be looking at more closely tonight. Can we get there? Is this realistic? But if we did have a 4-degree temperature rise, what are the consequences going to be? We would see an increase in sea levels of many meters, and an increasing frequency of drought across the globe. And in particular, desertification of the Mediterranean, Europe, and probably the US Southwest as well. Intense and frequent heat waves and floods. Every year we seem to be setting temperature records. And it wouldn't just stop at the end of the century. That graph that went to 2100, that line going up is going to keep going up, and we could be seeing temperatures even of 6 degrees Celsius. And that consequence, sea levels could be rising 13 to 15 meters above our current levels. These changes would be irreversible if we continued on that business as usual case. So this is what London might look like with that kind of global warming. We're seeing an increasing incidence of forest fires because of the drought conditions, and also some loss of living forests. And the costs of this are horrific. The Australians probably lost 20% of their forest just in last year's fires. So that's what we don't want. How can we avoid this? How can we avoid this business as usual case? And what are some scenarios that might lead us to that? So that's what we'll look at from here on. So I'll stop sharing these slides, and I'm going to now move to the climate simulator, and we'll be working with that for the rest of this evening. So I need to, oops, where are we here? We need to share it. Okay, are you seeing this simulator? Okay, good, thanks. So we talked a little bit, and I sent you, you may have seen the link of these levers down below here, what we call the control panel. So there are 18 different policies here that we can work with tonight in these different scenarios. So some of them are in energy supply, what we can do with coal. We can tax it or we can subsidize it. Coal, oil, natural gas, nuclear, any of these things. We could tax them or we could subsidize them. In the transportation sector, we could be looking at increased energy efficiency or electrification of transport, either at the current pace or perhaps at a slower pace if we think that's more realistic. than the current pace. Same thing in buildings and industry, both homes and factories, looking at increasing energy efficiency or electrification. And there's some growth. We'll talk about growth in a minute. I'll come back to those. And then the use of land, either reducing the rate of deforestation at the moment or increasing the forest cover. There's issues around methane emissions, which are another greenhouse gas besides carbon dioxide, and maybe some technologies to remove carbon from the atmosphere that's already there. So these are the things, some of the things that we have in our control that we'll work with. But what's driving all of this? And that's the first thing to look at. Why is carbon dioxide increasing in the atmosphere? Why are the greenhouse gases increasing? So the first factor is population. So as the population rises from its present 7 billion or so, most of the United Nations forecasts suggest that whilst birth rates have dropped dramatically, almost to replacement levels, those children are growing up healthy in larger parts of the world. And so our population will continue to grow as life expectancy increases, and those children have a longer future than in the past. So it could top out at somewhere around 10 to 11 billion. So that's certainly one driver for the amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. A second driver is the gross domestic product per person that developing nations are developing rapidly, especially in the global south. And so we're seeing that each of those persons are also expecting a better standard of living as the years go by. So that drives the greenhouse gas emissions even further. Now, in the meantime, the energy intensity of that gross domestic product is dropping, which is good. We're becoming more efficient in the use of our energy, and the economy is shifting increasingly towards a service economy rather than an energy intensive economy. And so there are some reductions in the energy intensity of this growth, this economic growth. But all of this, you multiply these four things together and you get a total carbon dioxide emission into the atmosphere rising from the present roughly 40 gigatons per year. On a business as usual case, we're heading towards perhaps 80 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year, essentially a doubling of the current rate of emission. And all of that's accumulating year by year in the atmosphere. And this carbon dioxide represents about 2/3 of all the greenhouse gas emissions. So the other third is coming from methane, nitrous oxides, and other greenhouse gases. And the other thing I'd like to introduce you to here is the sources of energy in the globe. And so this brown line represents the amount of coal that's being burnt in the planet. So at the moment, we're burning about 150 exajoules. We're getting 150 exajoules of our energy from coal, and that's doubling and perhaps even tripling by the end of the century. The red line here is oil. It does peak eventually, 2060, as oil becomes more expensive to extract, and would drop even in a business as usual case. Natural gas, the blue line, is rising rapidly. It's a less intensive carbon source, but it's also rising rapidly. Renewables, even in a business as usual case, the amount of renewables are increasing as they become more cost competitive and as other sources, particularly oil, become more expensive. Bioenergy, which is a lot of it is, for instance, coal for ethanol, or corn for ethanol, or wood pellets for fueling boilers and so on. Small line for nuclear energy across the planet, and then the orange line is for new technologies, which we haven't developed yet and could consider tonight if we wish. So those are the sources of energy. Now, the question for us to address here in using this simulation creator is, sorry, let me go back to our original graphs. So as we start to look at the post-COVID economy, and the various recovery programs that governments are putting in place around the world. So are there some things now that we could consider that might not have seemed nearly as possible 6 months ago? We've certainly seen a slowdown in the global economy. We've seen changes in people's commuting patterns. We've seen, will these persist? Can they be encouraged further? Are we going to go back to what was normal? But are we in an era now where we can think of some new possibilities? Or are there things we're already doing that we want to continue doing or accentuate? So that's a question. What I'd like to do tonight, given the number of people that are participating here, is to use the chat box and invite your participation and your ideas in the chat box. Laura will read through those for us and help us evaluate them and test them out with a simulator, just to see what would happen, what scenario might eventuate from that. So I'd like you all to take a couple of minutes now and just think of, what would you like to test with this? What would you like to try simulating here? What policy might be worth trying out here, and to see, what kind of an impact can we have on this projected global temperature increase? And I'll just say again, this is a global model, so we're kind of looking at saying, if everybody in the whole world put a new tax on coal down here, what might that do to the global temperature expectation? What might it do to the amount of coal that's burnt? And would it be replaced by other sources of energy? And what impact might that have on the global temperature? So that's where we're going to be working with from here. So could you take a minute or two now to put into the chat what you'd like to see us try? What do you think is perhaps more possible now post-COVID than it might have been before? Or something we're already doing that we ought to do more of? Let's try those out tonight. So put it in the chat, and I'll look to Laura to read some of that out to us, and we'll start to work with it.
Okay, we've got some ideas coming in. Let's just give a minute. Some great ideas, Doug.
I wouldn't have expected anything less.
Wow.
Audience.
This is ClimateFast for sure. Okay, let's start working on some of these. We have great ideas, increasing electrification, minimizing coal, methane gas regulations, getting rid of nuclear. An interesting one, slowing economic growth. I love that one too. No subsidies on fossil fuels. So a big theme is on the fossil fuels. So you might want to go to that one first and try to reduce some of those. Lowering deforestation, maximizing carbon pricing. Yeah, so I'll track these. You want to take a couple of those and start? We'll see what we can do with the temperature. These are great ideas, everybody. Keep them coming.
Okay. So why don't we start with coal as one of the fossil fuels. Ontario's already eliminated it, but Alberta and Saskatchewan are still heavily dependent on coal-fired electricity, and much of the globe, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, India are all heavily dependent on coal-fired electricity at the moment. So there are various ways we can use this simulator to discourage the use of coal, and we can just put a tax on it, is one way to do it. We can also accelerate the removal of coal-fired power stations from our economy. We can even put a stop on any new coal infrastructure. So these are different policies that we could test with this simulator. But just to keep it simple, let's look in here at putting a tax on coal. So at the moment, you can put a subsidy on it by moving a slider down this way, or you could put a tax on it, so many dollars per ton here. And then we'll look at what impact that would have on these different sources of energy and on the global temperature expectations. So if we move this coal tax up here, maybe to half of the maximum that seems practical, what do you think is going to happen to these various sources of energy, and in particular to this global temperature? So our goal is to get down below 2 degrees, ideally to 1.5 degrees to meet the UN, the Paris Agreement's targets. So how much is that tax on coal going to affect this global temperature over here? And what I'll invite you to do is put your guess into a poll here. And there's some options that you can choose. Is it going to change it by not at all, or the wrong way, or just by 0.1 of a degree instead of 4.1 degrees? We might only see 4 degrees. Or could it be a big difference by taxing coal, or even a huge difference? What's your expectation? So I'm launching the poll here, and I invite you to put your guess in there as to what do you think a tax on coal would do to our global temperature rise? So I think about 10 people have put a guess in there. We've got 40 of us here on the call tonight.
This is great. We're at 55 now, 55%, 60%, 65. Awesome ClimateFast participation. You're at 75% of people now.
Okay, well, let's another second or two for yes. Okay, let's stop it there. So it looks like pretty large consensus here, thinking it would affect it a little, perhaps 0.2, 0.3 degrees. So let's turn off the poll here, and we'll I want to close it. And now let's implement this. So we're going to put this in here. So, and I can replay what happened here. So if you see what happens, watch that brown line over here in the energy supply. So with that tax on coal, definitely the amount of coal being used goes down. But what else is happening? We can see an increase in natural gas. We see also an increase in renewables. And the global temperature now has dropped by 0.2 degrees. So your guess was pretty accurate that we got a small reduction in global temperature by putting that very high tax on coal emissions. And we certainly knocked down the use of coal across the planet, but it's been partly compensated by an increase in natural gas, which is a less carbon intensive source, but still has its own contribution to global warming. Now, there are some other co-benefits of eliminating coal. Often coal plants are located in low-income neighborhoods. Coal-fired power has a lot of particulates. We've certainly seen that in Ontario. I certainly remember before our coal-fired power plants were shut down, we were having a number of high smog days every summer. And we haven't had one for 2 or 3 years since the closure of our last coal plant. So there are some other benefits besides global temperature of a tax on coal and a reduction in coal use across the planet. So these are what we're calling co-benefits. Not only are we helping the global warming concern, but we're also gaining some ancillary benefits from this particular action. And so when you're using this simulator, there are some other things to watch for here. For example, when I moved that slider up here, that represented $63 per ton tax on coal, which is quite large. And you can see here that compared to the black line of the business as usual case for coal consumption, that's been moderated somewhat. It's pretty flat for the next couple of decades. And still rises slowly thereafter, despite the tax. Certainly driven by a continuing high population and GDP growth. Now, there's some further information that you can gather here by looking at this little eye under this policy lever. So it tells you, gives you some examples of how that policy might be implemented. It gives you some dynamics. For example, when coal is discouraged by taxing it, you see the brown line go down, which we did, but other things went up instead, like natural gas. We talked about some co-benefits that reduced air pollutants from coal burning, improves air quality and health. Here's another one, less coal mining reduces heavy metal drainage. We certainly know that coal mining produces a lot of toxic runoffs. Now, there are some equity concerns that if we put a tax on coal, that is going to raise energy costs. And we're going to see that affecting households. So here's the cost of energy, that by putting that tax on coal, this blue line shows us that it's going to start to become more expensive. And so low-income households are going to be more affected by this increasing cost of coal-fired electricity than other households. So that would be perhaps another thing that governments need to bear in mind in implementing a policy like this. Okay, so let's go back to get back to these graphs. Oh, I don't.
Let's try some energy efficiency in homes.
Yeah, I just need to find my way back to the original graphs. Okay. Sorry, what were you suggesting there, Laura?
Energy efficiency in homes.
Okay. So that would be down here, looking at buildings of all sorts. So that's both industrial buildings as well as residential buildings, and also industrial buildings, factories, and so on. So if we want to improve energy efficiency in this sector, and there's a variety of ways we can do that, more insulation, plugging of leaks, sort of low carbon footprint construction techniques in order to improve energy efficiency. So let's look at incentivizing that to a significant, oops, I better put our coal tax back on here. So looking at incentivizing building efficiencies, we can put significant incentives in here from governments. Let's look again, what impact do you think that would have on our global temperature increase if we look at improving energy efficiencies? And I'll launch this poll again. And we can use the same poll again. How big an increase do you think a significant change in energy efficiency in the industrial and residential sector would have? Is this going to be a small one, or is it going to be a bigger one, or even smaller than our coal tax? What's your sense of where we might go with that? Okay, so this, yeah, we got.
Go ahead, Doug.
Yep, so a bit more of a spread here. It could be anywhere from just a little bit, 0.1 degree, 0.2 or 3, and also a significant number of people saying could be quite big, 0.4, 0.5. Okay, so let's turn off the poll and let's, implement this policy. So let's go for big incentives in energy efficiency. Wow, okay, so that knocked us down from 3.9 to 3.5 degrees. And how did that affect these graphs here? Okay, so you see virtually a lot of these energy sources now are dropping. So we're using less coal, we're using less gas, we're using less renewables, we're using less bioenergy by implementing this energy efficiency. So we keep playing with it. Now, notice one thing didn't move, and that's this red line for oil, except towards the very end. But for many decades to come, improving energy efficiency in the building and residential sector hasn't reduced our consumption of oil at all, and the greenhouse gases that eventuate from that. So we've made a big improvement in reducing these energy sources, coal and natural gas, And we've gotten a significant improvement here in energy efficiency, in the global temperatures of 0.4 degrees. But it hasn't touched this red line yet.
For
And
the
again,
simulation, do you not have to put coal back to status quo?
yeah, I'm kind of looking at building a scenario here, if you will, that we can look at these in isolation one by one. But I guess it seems that, and certainly experience is that no one policy is likely to get us all the way to that Paris target. That we saw that coal moved us a little bit. We've seen now that energy efficiency moves us a little bit, but we're still a long way off the 2-degree Paris target. And so we can spend a bit of time later looking at individual policies, and you can do that yourself. But tonight I'd sort of like us to work together to build a scenario that might get us below the 2 degrees Celsius. So we'll need that coal tax, and we'll need this energy efficiency. And there are some co-benefits from energy efficiency. Again, we can look at this information here that yeah, by reducing energy used in buildings, homes or offices or factories, it's going to reduce our electricity bills or other fueling bills. And so we've got some cost savings by being more efficient in our use of it. And generally, better insulated homes are more comfortable. And there's also a significant job benefit, that there's a lot of jobs to be created by these energy efficiency programs, whether they're residential or commercial. One of the factors to bear in mind, though, is that often there's significant upfront capital costs to doing these energy retrofits, and that kind of money is not always available to low-income households and smaller businesses. And so again, as part of your policy, you'll need to look at these equity considerations. How are we going to make sure that more people can access this saving opportunity, and both the health benefits and the job benefits and the comfort that goes with it, and the cost savings. So let's go back to our scenario as we're building it here. So we've looked at a couple of policies so far: coal taxes, energy efficiency in buildings. What else might we consider?
I have an idea that hopefully will push it a bit more. This one won't surprise you. Let's increase the carbon price to $220 per ton.
Okay, so that would be a massive increase in carbon pricing. And currently the Canadian government has committed itself to $50 a ton by 2022. But other folks like the Ecofiscal Commission and Citizens Climate Lobby and other groups are saying that's nowhere near enough. We're going to need a carbon price that it pushes $200 a ton. So that would be pretty well up to the max here. And so what impact might that have? Let's go to the polls again for your assessment of what impact that might have. Let me launch this poll. So invite you to, yeah, so if we put a $200 a ton price on carbon, what's that going to do to this global temperature expectation? Is that going to be a little, a lot, or huge? What's your thinking on that? We've already seen some impact of the $30 price today and a $50 price in 2022. British Columbia, I think they're already up to $35 a ton. So I think most folks have participated here. So we're seeing most people expecting quite a big increase here of at least 0.4 to 0.5 degrees, perhaps even more than that for some people. So in this, I'll stop the poll now and close that. So in the carbon pricing here, you can get quite sophisticated as to how you implement it. Here you can have an initial price for a few years and then ramping up even faster afterwards. And you can have changes in performance standards and when those take effect. But for tonight, just to keep it simple, let's move it right up here to $200 a ton and see what that impact, what that does for us. Okay, so it knocked us down from 3.4 degrees to 2.8 degrees, 3.5 degrees, in fact. So we've had a 0.7 degree reduction in our global expectation of temperatures. And just watch again what moved. So coal gets knocked down even further here, this brown line. We're also seeing now natural gas comes down, and renewables, the green line goes up as a replacement. So if we're putting this high price on the carboniferous fuels, then that's going to incentivize renewables. But again, it hasn't done a whole lot to this oil line. There's some tax on that. It has come down sooner than it would have otherwise with that tax. So we're a long way now towards our goal. We started with the expectation of perhaps 4.1 degrees. But even a high carbon price, higher than anyone's talking about in government so far, at $200 a ton, that doesn't get us close to the Paris target. It took us down 0.7 degrees on top of that coal tax that was already there. Putting those two together moved us perhaps 1 degree in total towards our Paris target, but by no means all the way there. So that was a bit of a surprise for us in Citizens Climate Lobby, since we're advocating high carbon prices with the dividend returning to households to address that equity issue. That if as the conservatives said quite rightly, a price on carbon is a tax on everything, because our economy is so heavily dependent on carbon-based fuels and products. So it is a tax on everything, and that is costly, especially for low-income households. And so the idea of returning those revenues to households addresses that equity issue. But even with that very high carbon price, we're not at the Paris target. There's more work to do here for sure, and that was, I think, came as a bit of a surprise to us in the Citizens Climate Lobby. Now, another thing we can look at here, just to orient ourselves, is this particular graph, and it's showing us where this carbon dioxide is coming from. So we said that at the present we're in the 40 to 60 gigatons of carbon dioxide coming, or 60 gigatons coming from all sources, greenhouse gases and equivalents. So a lot of it is in this black area, which is coming from the fossil fuels used in energy production. So we've worked at knocking that down significantly with the policies we've got on the scenario so far. But there's another area here, and that's methane emissions, this blue area, and F gases. So these are refrigerants. They're also gases that are used in industrial productions. And the purple section up here is nitrous oxides, which are primarily a byproduct of fertilizer application using nitrogen as fertilizers. So they're continuing to grow. And if you're looking out here at 2100, they're probably now representing about half of the greenhouse gas emissions. So we've had policies that we've tried out here that looked at addressing the fossil fuel contribution to greenhouse gases. And we haven't yet looked at anything that's related to methane or these F gases or nitrous oxides. So I think someone mentioned reducing deforestation. Now that's an area here. You see this little green bar down at the bottom represents land use changes. So that's primarily deforestation, and it's contributing about 5 gigatons a year every year to our greenhouse gas emissions. So we could look at what would happen if we stopped that deforestation or reduced it significantly. What contribution is that going to have to our greenhouse gas emissions in total? So let's maybe have a final poll for your participation to see what you might think of if we have a significant reduction in deforestation. The burning that's happening in the Amazon, in Indonesia, and in Africa, what impact might that have on these greenhouse gas emissions? And the global temperature rise that's got to eventuate from that. So we're seeing a lot of people saying they could have a little effect, 0.2 to 0.3 degrees, perhaps even more, say some people. So let's have a look at it. If we go for a massive reduction in deforestation across the planet, so that's going to involve a lot of governments, there's the change. So let's look again at what it did to temperature. It went from 2.8 to 2.7, 2.8 to 2.7. So it had very little effect, 0.1 degrees. So even a massive reduction in deforestation doesn't have a big impact. And the reasons for that, as you can see here at the start, that deforestation, troubling as it is, for the loss of diversity, biodiversity, and often it's impacting the ownership and control of indigenous lands. So there's a number of equity considerations around deforestation. But in terms of its contribution to greenhouse gas reductions, it's only contributing about 5 gigatons out of this 60 gigatons that we have. So its contribution to global warming is rather small. Now, if we can reduce that deforestation, we can change it from being a source of carbon dioxide, so it's above the zero line here, and start to drop it below the zero line. So we're starting by allowing those forests to regenerate naturally. They're starting to add to carbon sequestration by forests, so that these forests can remove carbon from the atmosphere if they're allowed to remain intact. That was a worthwhile initiative for a number of reasons in terms of biodiversity and respect for indigenous ownership of lands, but in terms of contribution to greenhouse gas reduction, it only had a small impact. So now one area we haven't looked at yet tonight and is this big blue area here that's left in terms of methane emissions. And in this simulator, there's a couple of primary sources of methane and other gases. So the first is from agriculture and waste. And so that gets into this whole area of diet and a methane-intensive meat-based diet, and also intensive agriculture that leads to the application of a lot of nitrogenous fertilizers, and the nitrous oxide from that is a powerful greenhouse gas as well. And so if we wanted to look at impacting this agricultural contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, this is where we would do that. So reduced meat consumption, better agricultural practices. In fact, a reduction in wet paddy rice culture is another way of reducing methane. There are some dry paddy techniques that are being developed and trialed in Thailand and other countries. So all of these agricultural changes, you can simulate the impact of those in this area. And then secondly, a lot of methane comes from the production of natural gas, and even more if that gas is being produced using fracking techniques. And so Canada itself and many other countries have started to look at methane emissions from energy production. And in industry where they use F-gases as refrigerants, and in some etching compounds and other industrial processes, they contribute to these F-gases. So we could simulate changes in diet, changes in methane emissions from energy. And just to make it simple, let's look at a big change. I mean, changing diets across the whole planet. There's cultural considerations, as well as cost considerations, as well as the greenhouse gas emissions that go with it. And so changing cultures, changing behavior is not a fast process. Changing agricultural practices. Farmers tend to be conservative. What worked before is what they know is they can depend on. So let's look at, say, a 50% reduction in methane emissions from all sources. So that's both from agriculture and also from the energy sector. And what might that do to us? Oops, I got to say minus 50. We don't want a 50% increase. Let's go for a 50% reduction in methane emissions. And let's look at what kind of an impact that could have for us. Let me implement that. Wow. Okay. So that was another big impact. We went from 2.7 degrees to 2.3 degrees with that impact. So we've knocked down, as you can see here, the gigatons of carbon dioxide that's coming from the agriculture and energy sector has dropped from the present level of around 15, 16 gigatons to 5 or 6 gigatons. And so that's had a big impact for us. So we've made a lot of progress already with this scenario. We've started at 4.1 degrees. We're now down to 2.3 degrees. We're within reach of the Paris Agreement of 2 degrees minimum. What else might we look at?
There's a couple of ideas that have been raised by a number of people. So one is afforestation. So can we plant a ton more trees? And another one is on lowering economic growth. So thinking about back to the limits to growth, which we've been aware of for so many decades.
Sure.
We haven't think about it. So
okay, let's look at those two. So look at the forest growth one here. This is afforestation. That's planting trees, and you need a lot of land for that. And so when you're looking at, I think if you go up to the maximum here, in this particular model, if you look at how many hectares, how many millions of hectares that would represent in terms of new forests, it comes out to something like the area of India. So if you could find land across the planet that was comparable to the area of India and planted in trees, without affecting food production or other things, then you would have a massive increase in forestation. And so let's go for max. And that knocks us down to 2.2 degrees. So it only took us down 0.1 of a degree. Even planting enough trees to cover the equivalent of India, it's only taken us down 0.1 degrees. Now, what you can see here is it has that land use issue that was up here as a contributor to greenhouse gases is now reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So those new trees are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which is good. And there's other co-benefits of having more trees, of course. Again, biodiversity is improved. We all like to walk in forests for our mental health. And there are still many medicines that we haven't yet found in the forest. So there are all kinds of co-benefits of having more forests. But where are you going to plant these forests? So there could be some equity issues there. Whose land is it that you're going to plant these forests on, and how much control are they going to have over this? So it's planting a lot of trees has a lot of benefits, as long as you're bearing these equity concerns in mind. But it's not going to contribute a lot to our greenhouse gas production in total. It's a help. It's a little help, 0.1 of a degree, but we're still short. So let's look at economic growth, and we've certainly seen a significant reduction in economic growth with COVID, and that's been really costly and really painful. So is that something that can persist, or is that something that's not bearable? Those are big questions. And in this model, it's based on the current assumption of 2.5% GDP growth per person per year. So that's the business as usual case. That's what all the economic models are telling us is what's happening when you're looking across the whole planet. So that's developing countries as well as currently highly developed economies. If the average is 2.5%, can we knock that down? And what impact would that have? Certainly, it's going to be a driver. It's currently a driver of greenhouse gas emissions. What if we take that down to, let's say, 2%? So that's a small reduction in economic growth. What kind of an impact might that have for us? Let's try that out. Okay, so it's had a little impact. So knocking us down from 2.5% to 2.0% takes us down quite a ways in terms of what the developers of this model think is reasonable. What if we go all the way here? So that's a 1.7. So we restrict economic growth to 1.7% per year. And who's being restricted? Is that the developing countries, or is that the highly developed economies? Who's going to pay this price if we restrict economic growth? We're certainly seeing developing countries like China and India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brazil, all claiming that they have as much right to grow their economies and, if need be, use fossil fuels as the Western world assumed was its right in past years. But if we could restrict economic growth to just 1.7% per person per year across the whole planet for decades to come, then we're going to get to 2 degrees. And we've hit now our Paris target just. But it's come at a cost, and there are equity considerations to bear in mind, but we made it. One thing I didn't mention here when we talked about forests as to why the impact was so low initially. So part of it was that it wasn't a big contributor in the first place. But the other thing you can see here is, even if you started planting trees today in 2020, you're not really starting to see an impact until 2040, because it's going to take 20 or 30 years for a tree to become large enough to be a significant contributor to reducing greenhouse gases. So there is a lag that's built into both this model and because it's representing real life. One last thing I might just touch on before we pause here is carbon removal. And there's a couple of technologies. There's carbon sequestration being proposed in the fossil fuel sector, that they would capture the greenhouse gases as they leave the smokestack, and so that they don't contribute to the carbon emissions from those fossil fuels. And then there's also some other new technologies that are under development. You can explore these down in this section of the simulator. And there's a variety of technologies. One is bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. So this is where you're planting trees who pull carbon out of the atmosphere themselves. Then you burn those trees to generate energy, and you capture the carbon dioxide gases from that burning process and sequester it in the ground. So that's one technology that's under development. Another is direct air capture, and you may have read some breathless articles in the financial press about people setting up big sets of fans that are going to pull air through and grab the carbon dioxide out of that air and sequester it. So again, it's under development. There are minerals that you can spread across your land that will capture carbon and hold it. There's also the use of biochar in agricultural soils and other ways of capturing carbon and keeping them in agricultural soils. So these are all under development, and one or more of these may become practical in the near future. We don't know yet, but if you put a bit of hope into this, let's say there's some medium growth in one or more of these carbon capturing technologies, and then we can get ourselves under that 2 degree target and getting close to the 1.5. So let's just pause here and congratulate ourselves tonight. We did it. The suggestions that you put forward as we use this simulator to say, okay, what might that produce for us if we implemented, as you can see, not just one policy, even the high carbon price that Citizens Climate Lobby likes, or these other policies that we like for all kinds of other reasons, more forests. with these policies together, this particular suite of policies, we could perhaps get us down to 1.8 degrees as a global temperature rise. There's still some significant costs to that. We're seeing floods and wildfires even presently with a 1.1, 1.2 degree rise in temperatures. But if we can hold it to 1.8 max, that was the Paris target, and we got there. And now with this simulator, you can share this scenario. If you see here in the top right-hand corner of the simulator, there's a little bar that says share your scenario. So if you want to share this particular scenario that we put together here tonight, you can share it on Twitter, you can share it by, send the link by email, you can share it on Facebook. So that's another way of continuing the conversation with friends and neighbors about how can we get to where we need to be as a planet.
Doug,
So,
can I,
yeah,
Doug, just a really quick comment.
sure, Laura.
I know that there are some great questions in here, and some of you really want to get to a couple more of these.
Okay.
But what I would suggest is take that link and play with the model, and you can model out exactly what your question is, because we could do this for hours. Because
And I have.
so there are great ideas. I would say, please go to the model, play with it. You'll get your answers, and you'll probably discover a bunch of other things too. So
Yeah, it's a very powerful tool. Thanks for that, Laura. But what I'd like us to do now is to just pivot a bit, and I'd like you to first of all just tell me how you're feeling right now. Not about this model or about these particular policies, but just no, I need to get to this other poll. Okay, so I'm gonna just ask you, just punch the button here. Are you feeling mad, sad, glad, scared, confused, whatever? Let's just do a feelings check, and then we're going to do a bit of reflection. Okay, so we got pretty good range here, leaning towards glad, but almost as many sad, and there's all good reasons for all of this. There's what we're seeing here so far. But what I'm going to ask us to do now is to take 60 seconds of silence to just reflect on the possibility of creating a future like this. It's not the only possible future, even with this simulator, but it's the one we put here together tonight with your ideas. So I'm going to ask you to take 60 seconds to just think about the possibility of creating this future. And then we'll go into breakout rooms to talk a little bit more about that. And I'll let you know what question I'd like you to talk about in the breakout room. So I'm going to set my timer here, 60 seconds. Just think about the possibility of creating a future like this. We had our 60 seconds to think about this, and now I'd like you to go into breakout rooms. We have 5 people in a room, each room. And what I'd like you to do is to talk with each other about what would you love about this scenario or a world like this. So if we had a world with this carbon tax, coal taxes, more forests, less deforestation, what would you love about a world like that? And chat with each other about that. We got 10 minutes for that. Well, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for your engagement in that reflection exercise. And so we'd like to hear a bit more from all of you. If you could put into the chat some of those things that you named as things you would love about a future like this, a scenario. If we could live into that kind of a scenario in the future, what would you love about it? So if you could put those in the chat, and let's just hear a few of them from each other. And Laura will read them out for us. So what would you love about a future like this?
please put in the chat.
Yeah, could you type that into the chat, please? I know you had some conversations and reflections in your small groups, but let's hear a bit of that for the group as a whole.
Okay, so we have one starting to come in. So back to an increase in biodiversity, not increasing temperature. It's already warm enough.
Later.
Right.
Increased equity, cleaner air, clean water, healthy lands, forests, that we have a future. You know, this is the way that we're going to have a future, by reducing global warming. Would love to see all politicians learn how to use this model and talk about it. Yes, absolutely agree. Human survival, that absolutely. If we keep careening towards 4.1, which is going to lock in even higher, that comes into question. We have hope for co-benefits like reduced poverty, more citizen input into energy decision making, more equity. Fantastic. All of these feel really good.
Oh, that's good. That's great to hear from you folks. I mean, it's a big job. Any one of these policies, it takes a lot to gather support and to be implemented. So it is a big job ahead of us. But the benefits, as you've named, certainly are massive in terms of survival, biodiversity, equity, and a livable planet. And so there's a lot to be done. We can do it together. And looking again at these co-benefits, I'd just like to touch on this one more time with a slide here. That's part of the development from En-ROADS, and they spent a lot of time on this. So it's what they call the flower. So it's a framework for long-term, whole system, equity-based reflection. So as you consider each policy possibility, you can also look at, well, how does it affect food and water? So those agricultural methane reduction initiatives, how is it affecting water quality? How is it affecting food availability? Another area or petal on this flower is jobs and assets. So some policies will generate a lot of job growth. Other policies, not so much. And the assets, who's going to own this initiative, and what are the equity considerations in that? And we talked a lot about health benefits of some of these different policies, not just in reducing temperatures, but also reducing other forms of pollution, water, air pollution, and so on. Another is resilience. You know, how resilient is our society going to be if we implement this policy or don't implement this policy? And so there's quite a lot of information on the En-ROADS website that addresses these particular equity considerations, and they've done a lot of research on it and are continuing on that. So I'd commend that to you as well. One other thing we might look at here is what's happening in Canada, just by way of interest. And if I can pull up the, here's a scenario that, now I've trapped myself in my slideshow. Okay, I'll get out of my slideshow. And I want to share with you the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change, which is negotiated by the federal government with all of the provinces, I think except Saskatchewan. If we look at what their policy, and I'll just touch on this briefly, if we implemented everything that's in the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change from 2016, so that included reducing the subsidies or eliminating the subsidies on fossil fuels. That included a small price on carbon going up to $50 a ton in 2022, and they haven't said what happens beyond that. The new fuel efficiency standard, which comes into effect in the fall of this year, is going to bring about greater energy efficiency in the transport sector and the building sector. There are small incentives now from the federal government for electric vehicles. Trudeau has talked about planting a whole bunch of trees. And they have also talked about reducing methane and other emissions from the energy sector by 45%. Interestingly, the Pan-Canadian Framework says nothing about agriculture or changes to diet. So that's not in the Pan-Canadian Framework. But if we did everything that the federal government and provinces have promised so far, we would get to 2.7 degrees. So global temperature, if everybody in the whole world did what Canada has said it's going to do, we would get to still an increase of 2.7 degrees for the whole planet. So that only gets us halfway there. And so this can be a starting point for conversation with our own political leaders federally and provincially, that yeah, the Pan-Canadian framework, if we implemented it all as written, would get us halfway to our Paris targets, but we're not all the way there yet. So that's another thing that I can share that link and put it in the chat for folks that are interested in future. So just one last question I have for you then tonight is, given what we've talked about tonight, what you've thought about, and what's one thing that you would take away from tonight that you would like to do, that you feel called to do that's new, or maybe increase something that you're already doing as an affirmation of it? What's something that you would take away from tonight's session, this experience, that you feel called to do? It might be just talk about tonight with somebody. It might be some new personal action, or it might be some commitment to the political process. But put those in the chat, and let's hear from each other as to one thing that you might take away from tonight that you're going to do, an action, a commitment. And Laura, do you want to read some of those out for us?
Sure. So learning how to grow food and sharing that with others, keep pushing for a just and green recovery. Lots of people want to share this platform and talk about it with family and friends and politicians. I think that is fantastic. Change our language, stop burning and using carbon. Keep lobbying politicians, share the tool. So lots on this tool and lots of talking about it. And you know, the more you read, I think the number one thing we can do is talk about it, because then that can lead to action.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you for those commitments. And then just to help you with that, the En-ROADS website has a lot of information available on it, both this tool itself, the things I talked about from the flower diagram that look at the equity and co-benefits of these various policy initiatives. And they also have a training. So for folks that like to go deeper in it, you can just play with it as it is and explore it in whatever depth and time you've got for. If you'd like something more formal, they do have a training program, and they've now trained 500 En-ROADS ambassadors with 8 sessions. They're about an hour each, or hour and a half even, to go deeper into some of the system dynamics behind the simulator and some of the presentation possibilities. I think we mentioned at the outset, there's another format tonight, which you've had is what's called the workshop format. There's another format, which is a game. So it's a role-playing game, and you have 6 to 8 different parties that participate in a simulated United Nations climate conference. So you'll have one group that'll be the fossil fuel sector, another group that'll be renewable energy sector, another group that'll be governments, and it can be small governments or big governments, another group that'll be climate activists. And so these groups come together in a UN-like conference to negotiate policy changes to get us towards the UN targets. And each group presents a policy initiative in turn. Their policy proposal could undo somebody else's policy. And so you get a chance for some negotiation and some real life appreciation of the political dynamics behind the actual policies as well. So that's another format. Also on the website, if any of you are educators, there are quite a number of tools for use in schools. Assignments that students at various levels, even down into elementary school, right up to senior university level classes. So there are educational tools available on the website for you to use as well. And if you're interested in going deeper, then I'd really encourage you to take on the training as the climate ambassador. They have it as live sessions every month or two. Laura and I each participated in one of those, but the whole suite of training videos is online and available for you to use at your own time and place. And after going through those videos, doing a couple of practice runs with your friends and neighbors, then you can apply to become an En-ROADS ambassador as well. And as I said, there's about 500 ambassadors now, growing daily, across 65 countries. They've given over, what is it now, 20,000 presentations, sorry, participants, 20,000 participants across the planet. All of the materials are now fully available in Portuguese as well as English, and they're in the process of producing them all in Spanish, French, and more languages to come. As well as playing with the simulator, go and have a look at the En-ROADS website and look at the resources that they have there. So thank you for your engagement tonight. Thank you for your commitment to go further with this. I've had a chance to actually use it with the meetings with my member of parliament and with a member of provincial parliament. And so they're both policy wonks, so they got pretty easily engaged in it. And as you've seen, the simulator itself is quite visual, and it is engaging, and it's pretty intuitive. Try a policy, see what happens, and then talk about it. So it's not going to be easy, as we've seen how many policies were required here. I think, as the En-ROADS folks say, it takes more than one seed to plant a garden. And so we planted a number of seeds, got a fruitful scenario, but it wasn't easy, but it'll be worth it. So go for it. Thank you.
Okay.